Those who make themselves vulnerable invite evil. It is September 23rd, 1993. We are in Chicago's ominous South Side, known to be the poor area of the city. The South Side is known for criminal activity revolving around gangs, drug trafficking, and violent crimes. Due to this, many dark sites and dingy streets in the area are being carefully monitored by officers, detectives, and inspectors for any suspicious activity. On this night, a building inspector is doing his job and is casually monitoring an abandoned property. He believes it's a regular night for him, but this shift would be very different. A little while into his shift, after turning a corner, he spots something in the distance. He can't identify what it is, but as he comes closer, his heart stops dead in his chest. In front of him, on a loading dock, lies the dead body of a woman. Horrified, he calls the police, and they immediately rush to the disturbing scene. What the cops didn't know was that this poor woman would only be the first victim of one of Chicago's most notorious and evil serial killers.
We find a human body in an advanced state of decomposition.
Investigation begins. The police begin their investigation, and they examine the body of the woman. It's a grotesque sight, as she is naked from the waist down and has bruises on her hands. This indicated that she had put up a hard struggle against her attacker. Her face had also been brutally beaten and was covered by a cloth. The investigators found that intriguing and made a note of it. The victim's clothes were at the scene, but her shoes had been stolen.
We noticed that shoes were missing, and we knew that it was unusual.
Perhaps he wanted to sell them, or even keep them as trophies. The police immediately suspected she had been sexually assaulted, but the medical examiner found no signs of RP. They used the victim's fingerprint to identify her as 37-year-old Patricia Dunn. The police scour the area for any leads, but have no witnesses, evidence, or any fingerprints. The killer seems to be methodical and careful, and the police brace themselves for a difficult cat and mouse chase. The chase would indeed prove to be difficult, as due to lack of evidence, this case would go cold for 2.5 years. In 1995, during spring, a few kids are exploring an abandoned house, which is in the area where Patricia Dunn's body was found. The young children weren't prepared for what they would see, as they discover the dead body of a woman who is nude below the waist. There is a cord around her neck, her face is beaten and is covered by a cloth. Her shoes are missing, whilst her other clothes are at the crime scene. The police immediately knew this case was connected to Dunn's, as the state the bodies were found in were almost identical. A killing pattern is slowly emerging. The body is identified as 36-year-old Angela Shateen. She had been sexually assaulted and was also pregnant. DNA is recovered from her body, but police are still unable to find a lead. Unfortunately, this case also went cold. 2 years later, 42-year-old Claudia Robinson is walking in the same neighborhood where Shateen's body was discovered when she is suddenly attacked. The perpetrator forces her into an abandoned building where he savage beats her and rapes her. He throws a mattress over her body and takes her shoes. However, in a shocking turn of events, Robinson pretended to play dead and survived the horrible attack. Medical examiners found DNA on Robinson that matched the sample they had found on Shateen. They finally found physical evidence that linked the two murders. This confirms that they have a serial killer on their hands. They question Robinson about her attacker, and she describes him as a black male around 6 feet tall. The police finally have a vague lead, and the case has a small glimmer of hope. Robinson helps create a composite sketch of the man, and police distribute this across the area. Detectives in this case work tirelessly as they forge risky relationships with gang members, locals, and others. They worked thoroughly for 9 months, but were unable to make any progress. Then, on August 13th, 1998, 2 more corpses are found in 2 different abandoned buildings, around 1 mile apart. 32-year-old Nicole Thompson and 44-year-old Evandre Harris are found with their faces beaten, covered, and missing their shoes. Once again, the DNA on both bodies matched with the evidence found on Robinson and Chatine. Police immediately collect over 500 DNA samples in the area, but they are unable to find a match. Time was ticking before the killer would strike again. Over the next 5 months, police find 2 more bodies, 38-year-old Cheryl Cross and 44-year-old Cheryl Johnson. Once again, they are discovered in abandoned buildings with no shoes and matching DNA found on them. The murder count is now at 6, and the entire community is terrified. This is when the FBI decided to get involved in the case, as the killer was proving to be too much to handle for the local police. Soon after, the forged relationships the police made in the community are finally of use, as they find a very useful lead. 2 women inform the authorities about a man called Dre. They say he was known for getting violent with women in empty buildings. Another person also came forward with information about a man named Andre, who would get high with sex workers in abandoned buildings. Upon further investigation, they find a man named Andre Crawford, who was from the area and had been previously arrested for drugs and sexual assault. However, they need to find enough reason to have a court order for Crawford's DNA samples, so they search for a way to connect him to the murders. They figure out that when Crawford was locked up in prison for other offenses, the murders had stopped. The murders only resumed whenever he was out of prison. They found their man. On January 28, 2000, authorities demanded Crawford for a DNA sample. He initially refuses, but when they point out their court order, he gives in. His sample is a match. In a 3-day-long confession, he reveals everything. When recounting his first murder, Crawford reveals that he was providing Dunn with drugs in exchange for intercourse, but Dunn wanted the cocaine before the sex. This angered Crawford to the point where he struck her in the head and face with pliers and assaulted her as she lay dying. Crawford knew most of his victims, as according to a recovering drug addict named Katrina Martin, she lived with a man who let crack users get high in his apartment. Crawford was one of the users, and so was Patricia Dunn, Sonia Brandon, Constance Bailey, and 2 other women. All of these women would later become victims of the deranged killer. Most of his victims were prostitutes or drug addicts, and most of his murders would take place when he was transacting drugs for their services. Whenever women did something to his disliking in this transaction, he would lose control and attack them. He also disgustingly confessed to sexually assaulting the women's corpses after they had died, making him a necrophile. He confessed that when he murdered Dunn, he went for a walk to cool off, before he returned to ravage her dead body. When he was caught, he also stated, "I'm glad I was caught, because I was like a shark in a pool." In the end, he went to trial for 11 counts of murder and 1 attempted murder. He was charged with 10 counts of first-degree murder, 11 counts of aggravated assault, and 1 attempted murder. But what made Crawford turn into such a monster? If we look back to his childhood, we can get an idea. Andre Crawford was born in 1962 in Chicago. After his birth, his father would abandon him and his family. His mother would neglect him throughout his childhood, and this led to her being prosecuted for improper parenting. Crawford and his sister were placed in a foster family with 4 other children. He reportedly had been beaten by his foster parents and had also been sexually assaulted by other members in the family. This hasn't been proven, as they all deny these claims. He also claimed that as a teenager, he ran away from home to find his biological mother and relatives, but they also sexually abused him and forced him to prostitute himself. However, It was reportedly confirmed that Andre's biological mother was abusive and prostituted herself along with her son when he was 14. His foster father says that his son became addicted to drugs when he was 17 and dropped out of school. In the early 1980s, Crawford enlisted in the Army and would later enlist in the Navy. However, he would continue to use drugs and was later dishonorably discharged from the Army. This is when he would return to Chicago, where he would engage in drug and alcohol. He would often be at the red light district, presumably where he met most of his victims. He had trouble with housing and would either stay at friends' homes, homeless shelters, and even abandoned buildings. His lawyers would use his traumatic childhood to paint a picture where Andre suffered from neglect in order to lessen his sentence. It is clear that Andre had a very difficult upbringing, but nothing could ever justify what he would do. In the end, he was a monster who terrorized all of Chicago and committed monstrous acts of evil.